Hi, I'm Bailey McLaughlin,
And I'm Mary Muzinski.
and we did our research on the history of occupational therapy and people experiencing homelessness. So, for the first half, we went from the 1900s to the 1970s, kind of by theme. So, we'll lay out a few themes for you. And then when we get to the 80s, we start to find similar themes within decades. So, we'll explain that when we get there. But to start out, um, the early perceptions on homelessness and individuals experiencing homelessness kind of revolve around blaming them for the position that they're in. So, one source said that they were incurably lazy and useless. And basically, what you see is people were judged on their value based on their contributions to society, which is something that has not changed too much in general. But in this case, some studies showed that they wanted to clear out places that people who were experiencing homelessness where they were sleeping um, to take active measures to make other people feel safe where that's not really um, providing resources for those experiencing homelessness who need to sleep on the street, and they were more focused on the safety of the community, which was kind of an interesting fact. And they started to pay attention to the population that was unhoused when people started returning from war, which is very interesting, which is usually a bunch of young men. And once those young men were experiencing the same homelessness as these other people they were clearing out of the streets, they were like, maybe we should look into this. So that's kind of interesting. And yeah.
So then for the next kind of theme that we found, was just some research on homeless adults, families, and children. So as Bailey said before, they were still blaming the position that these people were in um, on the people, and especially if the people had substance use disorders such as alcoholism. So one of the kind of themes that they looked at was a link between alcoholism and people experiencing homelessness. So some homeless men had to go to taverns to avoid being arrested and to stay safe, because they would have been urinating on the street because they didn't have a place to go, and then they would be arrested because of that. Sometimes wherever they were staying, or like if they were in public housing or on the streets, they wouldn't have heat. So then they would go into the taverns to be able to have heat throughout the day. So then with these adults and families, they um, found a community with others who were experiencing the same thing. And so they kind of built their own um, family within um, others experiencing homelessness as well. So then there were also families who were given more opportunities to have stable housing. So they were placed in public assistance housing over single people. So although this allowed for the families to reintegrate and find stable housing, and they were in a study that they did, these families, most of the families in the program, were able to maintain their stable housing and kind of reintegrate. Um, but those who were single weren't seen as much of a priority, and they then weren't able to take advantage of the public housing. And then also for children, the children were the most nurtured for and shown the most respect as people experiencing homelessness. And most of the blame for their homelessness was put on the parents. So saying like the parents experienced um, incarceration or mental health issues or substance use disorders, or they just left the child. Um, so all of that blame was put on the parents rather than the child. And then they had also done some research kind of seeing the impact that homelessness and having a lack of having parents how that negatively impacted a child's development. So then they then made children a priority. So just some interesting facts about a very broad topic, but they did a lot of research on how homelessness impacted adults, families, and children. And then next, we kind of focused on some organizations who were serving the public. So one of the earliest organizations that helped those who were experiencing homelessness was the Salvation Army. And although they did offer support um, and just like housing and food and shelter, they called it an effective means of dealing with the most unsatisfactory of human beings. And they still ended up reprimanding them, blaming them for failing police courts, and then providing them lodging that was dangerous to their health. So, although they were giving them shelter and some assistance, it wasn't necessarily the assistance that they needed. And then the Catholic Church was also one of the first organizations that served people experiencing homelessness, and they provided with some services, but they only really provided housing to young women for a week or just for very limited amounts of time. Um, so it was extremely temporary, the type of service they gave.
So, as Mary said, assistance from the public started creeping up, and shelters were discussed as far back in research that we found as far back as 1897. And even then, um, safety was still kind of surrounding people of the town who weren't experiencing homelessness. But in 1930, someone said that reform has to come from the government. Um, so it's still chugging along since 1930. But there were a lot of studies on reintegration and people who needed extra assistance. So there was one study on a home for young people and who were experiencing homelessness. And the physician found, so this was done by a physician rather than an occupational therapist, but the physician found that the most important factor in dealing with young children is time and compassion was the most important factor in making a difference in their lives. And OT starts to pop into the picture around the 70s in this population with a welfare hotel. And they had discharged hospital patients there, elderly adults, alcoholics, addicts, and people who were previously incarcerated. They started an OT program. There weren't a lot of people participating in the beginning. There was a lot of overcrowding, kind of how OT is now. They had to make do. So they set up in the middle of the hallway, and even if people were drunk, they said, come on, let's attend. And the program grew into starting a kitchen, and everyone had cookouts every week. And so they were able to be fed and learn how to cook and do a bunch of other things that would help support the community. So this showed great improvement. There was more funding put towards it, but then funding got cut, program got cut short. But there was a lot of great research that went on there that helped to decrease isolation among the participants and helped them advocate for themselves over time. So OT was doing some great things. And that's where this research, we start to see the groundwork set and the execution of occupational therapy's role in people experiencing homelessness. You'll notice we're saying people experiencing homelessness or the unhoused, kind of a version of first and first language, just so you know as we're going through. So if we start at the 1980s, hospitalization, we've all heard deinstitutionalization. So we're starting to see that OT role and helping through people working at a hospital. And they started to see, hey, maybe we should do some outreach. So they put out some physicians, nurses, social workers on the street trying to help people, especially because those relationships were strained a little bit. And there was really great research on it. It was very positive. It made a big difference. And besides that research, there was no real any sort of carryover after that research because deinstitutionalization started to happen. And basically, the research article that talked about that said that professionals need to become involved in advocacy and the bureaucracy of everything So the studies that showed how beneficial treatment could be involved they call them chronic alcoholic male vagrants. So they had them work on a farm, had some do some chores every day to help out the community. It was great, but what was most important was when they got reintegrated back into the community in the city, they were provided resources once they got there. That was super important after rebuilding those foundational things. And AJOD actually published an article in the 80s about house fire victims. That was the wording they used. And they did some observations and activity analysis, and they decided that rehabilitation for the unhoused not only has to deal with meaningful activities and access to resources, there's a huge psychological component, and there has to be a lot of reflection done to be able to have any meaningful actions. So that reflection isn't just for people who don't have houses anymore that were burned down, but just anyone. You'll see that in the research as we go along.
Yes. So in the 1990s, they kind of began to incorporate how important occupational performance was, and then also acknowledge the comorbidities, which were often found in people experiencing homelessness. So one study was done on women in a shelter, and they were evaluated for independent living skills, traumatic experiences, and symptoms of PTSD. And most of the women had traumatic experiences and symptoms of PTSD, and as well as deficits in the independent living skills. So the study kind of indicated that traumatic experiences and mental illnesses are often comorbidities with experiencing homelessness. And along with this, people who are unhoused may find it difficult to complete certain independent living skills. The main deficit that they had found in this study was with money management. So then in another study, they had made an OT workshop for people experiencing homelessness, and it helped these participants to reintegrate themselves, find balance in their new lives with a new pace of kind of like the daily routine that we all might think of, just like getting up, getting ready, going to work, coming back. And they kind of restructured their lives and were able to find confidence in their abilities. And they then became more, quote unquote, valuable to society. And then they also continued to look at mental health of children experiencing homelessness and attempting to treat them. So rather than just looking at the comorbidities, they were also taking action and making programs to see how effective they were. So at the beginning of the study, it was with level 1 fieldwork students, and these students looked at children and their mental health and then attempted to treat them with an OT lens in their curriculum. And then towards the end of the 1990s, they began to notice the importance of occupational justice and working at a legislative level. So OT can only do so much as a profession. As much as we like to think that we can change everything, legislation assists in preventing future homelessness and then also helping those experiencing homelessness currently to have a better situation and kind of rise up out of that. So just at the end of the 1990s, they talked a lot about just like really noticing how important it was to begin advocating for our clients on more of a legislative and legal level. So then in the 2000s, there was even more emphasis on advocacy, and just kind of seeing how like so important it is. And through this advocacy, it's not only advocacy on a legislative level, but then another study also found that we need to work on expanding the knowledge of the need for OTs in this population. So, like putting information into um, school curriculums, and then just also like really emphasizing the importance of advocacy again on a legislative level with students in OT school. And then another part was increasing occupational engagement. So, realizing the importance of engaging in daily activities, especially meaningful activities. So, the participants experiencing homelessness can successfully reintegrate. And then they continued to do research on the comorbidities of mental illness and homelessness, as we've stated throughout our presentation, but um, just if, as research has progressed, they also have increased research on just how integrated mental illness and substance use disorders and homelessness are with each other. And just how occupational therapy can really assist with interventions and then continue to advocate to create change with systemic and political issues.
So just as Mary said, there's a lot more research. There's research on the lived experiences of people who are unhoused. So they found that a lot of times, like survival occupations are the goal, like that people are just trying to complete every day. And a big goal of people who are unhoused are want to just engage in ordinary occupations instead, which really highlights the occupational injustice of survival versus ordinary occupations. Um, and then a big highlight is promoting social and psychological integration, and that occupational transition from unhoused to housed. So they explored that transition a lot more in OT's role. A few studies um, looked into that and looking at the environments that OTs can build to help facilitate that transition. They also looked, and Mary mentioned before, at the kids. They looked at kids who, those who were poor housed, actually had better social skills and fewer behaviors, like fewer behavior problems, than those who were completely homeless. So there were small differences in your housing can make such a big difference for especially kids. So this is a huge push for EI and other things like that. And there are different creative strategies that were explored too. So weekly activities and workshops, new mediums to express themselves. And as I mentioned before, the psychological component is so important to be able to handle this kind of transition. So just as an overall reflection, there is a lot of good research, but there's a lot of gaps in the research, and there's a lot of places for OT to be more part of the practice in that transition. It's a lot of nice things to talk about it, but we need to get in there. We need to advocate to lawmakers. We need to advocate even within our own clinics and within our own groups of friends and family how important this transitional stage is. So there's a lot of good stuff out there, but we need to do a lot more good.
Yeah, that's pretty much my reflection as well. Just we um, have kind of put some pieces together of like, yes, homelessness may be caused by some mental illness. So then that's also kind of like more of a push for us to work with mental illness and advocate for that on a legislative level. So just we have a lot more advocating and work to do, even though there is a lot of good information out there. We need even more to best serve this population. And then, just as a reminder, complete the historical analysis seminar reflection after you watch this. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. Have a good night.